Yes.
Well, you didn't talk very much about political forces, and I know you were involved in a very progressive planning effort in Palm Beach County that was beaten by political interference.
By corruption, actually.
Maybe you want to talk about how that
Well,
works.
we didn't have anything to do with that. No, we did have that's good. You're talking about the sector plan in Palm Beach County. Yeah. The plan actually that was developed was never saw the light of day in any significant way, and so it was never evaluated on its own merit. What was actually going on was a very unfortunate political process. But let me set aside the fact that really went so far even to result in jail sentences and so forth. The political process can do the same thing with all good intentions. And I think that what we as planners have to do is we have to have a certain integrity to what we're doing. We can't simply put our finger up the wind and say, well, which way is it blowing? But at the same time, we have to be students of politics, understand what will work and what will not work. And that's a fine line that you draw. But I think that again, the role of the planner, the professional planner, is one to be an advisor. And it's going to be up to the decision makers to weigh those choices that are there. I think from a planning standpoint, the best we can do is give those decision makers the best product that we can. But the politics of it when I do teach and students will, I have people talk to students to say, you know, planning would be great if it weren't for politics. I said, wait a minute. Planning is a public process. Politics are part of it, just like it's part of the decision making. It's part of the democratic process. It has a lot of rules to it, essentially, and I think that's one of the different. Politics is always there, and I think that if you work in it, you have to understand it's there. It doesn't mean that you. Well, I think our best job is to try to provide the best product that we can to respond to that vision. And, you know, again, it's very important. The more you can really get a shared vision, usually the much more powerful that can be. When you can get people to really sit down around a table, and these are lengthy processes, don't mean to suggest they're simple, they're not. And you get a buy-in from the community, that can be extraordinarily powerful. If you don't have that buy-in, then it's just whoever shows up the zoning. And that's what we have. It's very hard to do. I mean, how do you get people away from their busy lives to come out and go through a series of public workshops when you're just doing a comp plan that doesn't directly affect the property next door? Very difficult to do and a huge challenge, but again, one we think is worth the effort. And that's the only solution I really have to the political process. You have to use it, work within that to develop a good vision.
That will help influence the politicians. If you have a community behind it, the politicians can't go off half-cocked.
Well, exactly. Yeah. Let me give you one quick example. I was in planning director in Springfield, Missouri. South was now Missouri State University. Was on the edge of the downtown, but it was encroaching into neighborhoods on its boundaries. We put together a program where we involved the neighborhoods and the university and businesses and so forth around it, developed a neighborhood plan, and said, how do we prevent this encroachment? And we only did two things. We said you can only have 5 unrelated people in the house, and you had to have a parking sticker to park next to the university, and it stopped that process. But what was important was the neighborhood bought into it. And that plan, and this was not an official comprehensive plan adopted under Florida rules. It was simply a plan that the neighborhood and the city adopted. Remained in place. It's still there. I check once in a while. It's still in place because they got a buy-in from the neighborhood that says this is what we're going to do. And the Missouri State University reversed its growth pattern back to where we wanted it to be anyway. I'm just using that as an example of how powerful that interaction can be, and you'll see that happen over and over again if you allow it to happen.
Can you hear? Can anybody hear? Oh, okay. One of the growing, and I see this in looking at the picture of Key West, one of the growing, I guess, issues also in terms of developing and community building is history. And how much has the debate over historical significance, maintaining a structure or even something like a cemetery or a possible burial ground versus developers' needs, how much has that grown? Because I've seen it grown significantly in South Florida. How much across the state?
Well, I haven't done a survey of that question, but I would say that the degree to which history is valued depends on the community many times. I think most communities will give some value to history, but some are very aggressive about it, and that's where you do see real efforts made to preserve sites or buildings that are of great importance. Historic preservation is simply one of the topics that we deal with, and it's very much a part of how we revitalize, how we handle infill, how we handle redevelopment. On the one hand, we know redevelopment is generally good because we are reinvesting, but how do you maintain those? And there's a whole body of expertise that grows up around the historic preservation. So it's certainly not neglected, but depends on the community on how much emphasis they may place on it.
You mentioned community character element. Would that be composed of, like, say, design guidelines or form-based codes, or does that belong more in your zoning code?
Well, the question was, does community character, and did that involve form-based design guidelines or form-based zoning, and should that be in the zoning? I think the distinction here is that if we think of conventional zoning, it's not form-based. It simply says, in this district you can have these uses and they can be this dense, and you got to have a setback. Nothing about that has anything to do with design other than how much grass you've got around the house. The notion of form-based zoning and community character typically introduces an element of design, and in effect says that how you build the building, what the building looks like, its scale, doesn't necessarily have to be architectural design, although sometimes it is, if it particularly is historic. But what's its scale? What's its relationship to the street? What's its relationship to the building it goes to? That's where we've really been evolving over the last 20 years or so, largely out of new urbanism and so forth, to recognize that community character is just as important as density and so forth. And that's one of the things that will typically resonate with people. If you ask them, what do you want, particularly small communities, what do you want your community to be? Well, we want to be what we've been. We want to grow, but we want to maintain the character. Well, that's actually possible to some degree, and that's what community character is usually about, is how do we achieve the growth but still retaining some of that character that we value.
But does it require a separate element of the comp plan, or should it be adopted as part of the zoning code?
Oh, I think it ought to be part of the zoning code. It's just you just approach it differently. You're going to have some districts that you handle in a different way, where you've actually got a design element involved that you don't have in a conventional one. Now, I would also offer that anytime you introduce design into your planning and regulations, you've introduced a complexity. I don't generally suggest that communities that are of any size suggest they're going to have architectural review of everything they do. But they may have areas, their downtowns, historic districts, and so forth, where they may want to do. It may be more selective. But it needs to be part of your code. But it may be handled in a different way. Yes?
Well, you were saying that it would take a while, before it became law or part of the plan to have this smart growth. Is that correct? Are you saying that?
Yeah, we have. The comment was it would take a while for the smart growth principles to become law. I didn't mean to say that they were necessarily would be codified, although some states have done it. Maryland, for example, has a smart growth concept in their state law. I don't see any movement in Florida to codify smart growth, but there are elements of our laws that are doing that. For example, the discouragement of urban sprawl is an element of that. The emphasis on transportation with mobility is an element of that. But we're not calling it a smart growth. Florida's code is not a smart growth law. What I meant by the time is that we're actually seeing these concepts come about by good planning at the local level, and so we're seeing the value of these concepts taking place, and we didn't see them at all 20 years ago, and you're now beginning to see the effect of that change of thinking. But it's actually been a relatively fast process as these things go. It's still not as rapid as we'd like to see it, but it clearly is taking hold. But it isn't yet codified, and I don't see a movement to actually attempt. It's very hard to codify, but there are clearly some elements of what we're doing in the way of transportation and mixed use and so forth that move in those directions. Dr. Boss.
So you've done this training program for quite a while, too.
Yes.
So what would you say about it?
I've never done it quite this way, but it's.
No, I'm quite surprised how well that went. So, what was your experience with those officials? You know, how knowledgeable were they actually about planning? And knowing that that was probably not your typical official that actually attended.
Say it again. I didn't quite pick up. Go. You can say that. I just didn't quite pick it.
So, what was your experience with those planning officials?
Right.
How well informed were they actually about planning? And how responsive were they to the ideas that you were bringing across?
Did you give them a test when it was over?
No, I didn't try to give them a test, although we are talking about putting the training program online where you have a course, in which case we would give it. Let me take a second to say that there are 6 states, not the same 6 that have comprehensive planning as mandate, 6 states that mandate training for planning officials. 2 or 3 of them are, the legislature one night at midnight decided they were going to do this. South Carolina, for example, and they thought, well, with the dog that caught the car, what do we do? There are other states that are pretty sophisticated with it and so forth. We've actually talked about asking the legislature to make it mandatory in Florida, so part of our thinking was how would you actually create a curriculum? We probably wouldn't do 2 days, we would do 1. And with the idea there'd be some certification. So in that case, there has to be some kind of test or something that says you took it. But to get to your question is, what do you find? Generally, I find in small communities virtually no knowledge of what we're talking about. And their reaction typically is after they got over the deer in the headlight syndrome. They said, thank you for enlightening us on often some very basic kinds of things. Now, keep in mind that many of the small communities in the state have no professional planners. Now, your larger communities have staffs, and so your planning officials are going to get a good deal of this kind of thing. And the kind of thing we're teaching folks are not unknown to our planners. I mean, your professional planners understand what we're talking about here, but they often don't sit down and put the elected officials in a session and say, here's a training session for you. I've had a couple of occasions where I put this on a number of different forums. Clay County up in the northeast part of the section has for 3 years asked me to actually do it for the planning commission, actually standing in front of the commission on the dais in their commission chamber. Most of the others are done in workshops and at conferences and this kind of thing. But the general finding is that they are not particularly knowledgeable about some of the nuances they need to understand. And you have to also recognize that there's a constant turnover. They are changing all the time. And so you really have people being asked to make decisions that they need some kind of background understanding about what they're doing. I tried to give you a little bit of sense of what that was. And they don't typically have it. And I think that's one of the problems that we run into in terms of results that we're uncomfortable.